Okay, so this is the subcommittee meeting for subcommittee 3, and we're going to be discussing task 4B. We do not have a chair yet identified. That will be part of the agenda. So as we're going through these items, if anyone would like to consider serving as chair, that would be great. The only items that you would need to consider is that wherever you are, that's where the meeting will be identified on the agenda as the physical location. As required by the Open Meetings Act, we need to have an establishment available for the public to participate if they so choose. And so just take that into consideration as we go through the meeting. So we'll go ahead and get started. And in terms of our subcommittee members, I wasn't here at the beginning of this morning's subcommittee, so did we just go ahead and go around the room and identify who was present? Okay, so Levi, you want to go first?
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Levi Bryan. I work as a civil engineer for LC8 in Odessa, Texas. I represent water utilities as my special interest group.
Thank you, Levi. And we also have Sal Massoud with DRE Engineering. Sal, would you like to introduce yourself?
Certainly. Everybody can hear me?
Yes, sir.
I'm Sal Massoud. I'm a private business owner of Del Rio Engineering, and also serving as the current 2021 president of the El Paso Association of Builders. And therefore, I am on this group through a nomination with Texas Association of Builders, TAP. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, Jeff Bennett.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jeff Bennett. I'm a hydrologist and geologist working for the Rio Grande joint venture. We work to conserve bird habitat. I've been working in stream restoration and environmental flows for about 20 years, and so I sit in the environmental interest chair.
Thank you, sir. And we also have Delbert Humberson with the IBWC.
Hi, I'm Delbert. I'm a hydrologist with the Water Accounting Division at the International Boundary Water Commission.
Thank you. And so that rounds up our subcommittee members, but I know that we also have guests. And so if you all can identify yourselves, Dr. Blair. Oh, Dr. Blair, your mic is not working. We don't hear you. No. We can't hear you, Dr. Blair. We'll see if we can get that resolved.
Now? Can you hear me now?
Yes, yes.
Okay, sorry about that. I had to switch mics. My name is Al Blair. I'm the district engineer with El Paso County Water Improvement District in El Paso County.
Great. And then in terms of IBWC, I think we have one more participant. Doctor, would you like to identify yourself?
Yeah, for Bobora, I am the lead hydraulic engineer, USIBWC El Paso.
Thank you, sir. And so I think, have I captured everyone who's here in the meeting? If not, go ahead and introduce yourself before we turn it over to AECOM.
Yes, ma'am. This is Ramon Macias. I'm principal engineer for IBWC.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Macias. Okay. All right. Well, then what we'll go ahead and do is I'll go ahead and turn it over now to AECOM so we can start getting into the discussions in terms of the purpose of the subcommittee and what you all will be covering today.
All right. Thank you, Annette. Can everyone hear me okay? This is Chris Wright. Well, this is Chris Wright with AECOM. I'll just do a quick introduction of the team from AECOM that's on this call today. We've got Brian Blaisdell, who is an assistant planner for one of the lead planners in the project in this study for the regional flood plan. We've got Jeff Irvin, who's one of our principal engineers, and also one of our lead planners, and we've got Gilbert Onduho, who is the project manager. We've also got Clint Kimball, who will be maybe not joining us on all of the subcommittee calls, but we wanted to have him on this first meeting. But we will be asking him to join any calls that have to do with the county, because he just recently worked on some master planning, stormwater master planning projects for the El Paso County. So that is our group. I don't think I left anybody off, but if I did, please feel free to interrupt me. But with that, I can go ahead and start sharing my screen here, and then we can get into this presentation. 1 second. Can you all see my screen okay?
Yes.
All right. Let me just see if I can get it into presentation mode here. Maybe I'll just do it like this, probably better. Okay. So this is the agenda that we have for today. We're going to be, we've already kind of covered the subcommittee members. We'll talk about the, actually we're going to jump back into the subcommittee members just real briefly, but we'll then talk about the objective of this subcommittee in general, and we will go into a presentation on some technical issues where we'll define what are FMEs and FMSs. We will talk specifically about the consideration of levies in the state flood plan, in the risk evaluation, and also in some of the proposed project prioritization and how they'll be considered. Then we'll kind of wrap that up with a discussion on what an overall recommendation to the regional flood planning group might be as a result of this meeting, if we want to propose one. And then we'll hand it back to Annette to discuss the confirmation of the chair for this subcommittee and any future meeting dates that we'll set up. So I just want to show this slide really quick to show which people, which members of the flood planning group are participating in this subcommittee 3, and which ones are voting members. And so the US IBWC is the only non-voting member here.
You go on your slides, Chris. We're only seeing the agenda.
Oh, sorry. Here we go. So yeah, the Dr. Bora and Delbert Humberson, as I mentioned, were with the US IBWC, and they're the only non-voting members. The rest that are participating are voting members, but we also have Dr. Blair from the Water District, who, since he's not a member of the RFPG, he would not be a voting member. But Omar Martinez, who's representing the Water Districts, is. So I just wanted to go over that briefly in case there are any questions about members and non-voting members. Next, we'll talk about the objective of the subcommittee. So the main thing I wanted to point out on this slide is that this committee is supposed to consider the entire region. So we will be representing the entire region, and if anyone has related topics from anywhere in the region, they can feel free to bring those up. This particular meeting is going to be focused on the Rio Grande main stem. There are going to be other meetings that will focus specifically on the main stem, and we'll be able to send out an agenda in advance so that you all can see which meetings those will be. And those will be the ones where we'll request attendance from IBWC, from Delbert and Dr. Bora, because we didn't want to have them attend all of the meetings, because like we said, not all of them are going to address levies in the Rio Grande. So we're going to try to separate them out So we have specific meetings that focus on the levees, and this is one of those. Next, we'll get into the presentation of the technical issues. And so first, we want to start out by giving an example of the definitions of FMEs and FMSs. And I'm not going to read the slide to you here. There's a lot of words, but I just wanted to point out these are copied and pasted from the scope of work. But basically, a flood management evaluation is in a location where you may not have a detailed H&H study. And so we'll talk a little bit about what an example of that might be, but it's basically in locations where we might need to do some more modeling or a study before we can come up with projects or flood management strategies. Flood management strategy is basically a proposed plan to reduce flood risk, and a flood mitigation project is a proposed project to reduce flood risk that has a non-zero capital cost. And so this is, again, just information from the scope of work, summarized a little bit. It's not exactly word for word, but I won't go through all these. I just wanted to point out that flood management evaluations are in areas where we don't have H&H analyses necessary to evaluate FMSs and FMPs, that we do need an equitable comparison between all FMEs. So the methods that we come up with, we'll have to weigh those across our region and ultimately across the state with other FMEs. So they all need to be on an equal, I guess, scoring plane, similar with the projects, which will establish benefits and risk associated with each project or strategy. We also want to point out that it states here whether H&H, we need to indicate whether H&H models are already developed or whether they will be developed in the near future. And that kind of ties into a little bit about what we're going to talk about today with the Rio Grande. And then lastly, I was just going to point out that these FMEs consider the number of habitable structures and population in the FME area. So we don't actually have to quantify how many houses are taken out of the floodplains, but we do have to quantify in our report, how many are in the area that we're proposing to consider this FME study. Some examples of an FME are, for our region, for example, of West Texas, there's a lot of locations where FEMA models have not yet been established, and so there might be no FEMA floodplains, or there could be very old FEMA floodplains. And so we'll have to make some decisions about how we assess risk in these areas. And one option there is the fathom study, which, if some of y'all aren't familiar, that is a nationwide study that is being done by a company named Fathom that is actually working with one of our team members on this study. That team member is Aqua Strategies. So they've been giving us some helpful information. We actually provided a memo for review by the Regional Flood Planning Group. That was a draft memo to be considered for Chapter 1 that basically talks a little bit about how Fathom was considered in West Texas and Upper Rio Grande region, and it gives a few examples and screenshots of comparisons of different flood risk. But that is an option to consider in areas where we don't have FEMA floodplains. It's a little bit trickier when you're considering areas adjacent to a levee, because we'll get into some of the assumptions in those Fathom models related to levees. The next is an estimation of 1% and 0.2% flows in the Rio Grande. There is some conflicting studies out there about what hydrologic assumptions to consider in the Rio Grande and for the 100-year. And so we're going to talk a little bit about those in detail. But example is with all these different studies, what do we assume? Which one do we assume is correct? And we also know that there's an ongoing study, so we'll talk about that too. And then the other thing is, if those studies or models that are best available, they might be 1D, whereas when you're dealing with levees overtopping to assess damages on the other side of those levees, you might need a 2D model. So we may need to come up with in the short term, if we don't have the types of models we need with the confidence that we want, we might need to come up with some sort of study that develops assumptions for those types of models. I'll get into the FMSs now, where we are going to be, again, this is kind of just some of the guidance in the scope of work or the requirements that are listed in the scope of work. I highlighted in red where we have differences from the FMEs. So I won't go through and read all of these, but basically I wanted to point out that, again, we need to have an equitable comparison between all FMSs. So the methods that we use should be consistent throughout the region, and how it's considered throughout the other regions is also important. So we want to make sure that we're making similar assumptions for our benefits we're going to get than other consultants are making in other regions within the state, because in the end these are all going to be combined into one state flood plan, and they'll be almost competing against each other for some of the available funds. Sorry, let me just turn off sound. I don't know if y'all are hearing some of the buzzing going on, but excuse me. All right, the next thing I'll point out is that we have to have no negative impact to the neighboring areas. So the FMSs should show that no negative impact. And then I'll jump into an example of an FMS. So one of the topics of today that we want to discuss is it's likely we'll have an FME to identify scenarios of risk, but in the interim, while we don't have this ideal model that shows the most accurate depiction of flooding on the adjacent side of the Rio Grande levees, maybe because the hydrology is uncertain or due to some issues with hydraulics. In the meantime, we still want to be able to prioritize projects related to the Rio Grande levees. So it might be most appropriate to develop an FMS for this using the best available models we have. So an FMS would define, what goals are going to be addressed in the FMS, what are the best available models with the appropriate software to use. For example, if maybe the best available model is a Flow2D model, but if we need to run several iterations, it might be more appropriate to use a 1D model. Also, does the model show protection from the 1% AC event? That in AC is annual chance. That's another important factor. We'll also consider the strategy for quantifying the flood risk is another important one that we want to talk about a little bit, because when you're dealing with levees, we'll get into some of the details about what assumptions need to be made, and there are still some gray areas where we'll have to coordinate with TWDB and try to make sure that whatever we're assuming is going to be consistent across the state, because we don't want to assume one thing and somewhere else across the state they assume something totally different, and then we're not all being measured on the same playing field. And then we'll also talk a little bit about FEMA levy accreditation. All right. So now we'll get into, unless there's any questions on what is an FME or an FMS, Are there any questions on that before we move into kind of the meat of what we're planning on talking about today? Some specific examples related to the Rio Grande flooding. Any general questions about FMEs, FMSs? Okay, because yeah, that's basically the focus of this subcommittee is to develop recommendations for the RFPG for specific FMEs and FMSs. And so this first meeting here, we want to dive right into a big issue that's important in El Paso and south of El Paso, you know, throughout our study limits. But probably the highest concentration of population where the Rio Grande levees affect the general population is in El Paso. And so that's why it's such an important topic. And so we want to make sure that we're all on the same page as far as what assumptions need to be made. And we know that a lot of people have very strong feelings about, you know, how we should consider the levees and mapping. And so we'll just start out by talking about the FEMA rules. And basically for FEMA in the context of goals for a regional plan, they do not consider levees unless they are accredited. And the levees need to check a series of boxes that have to do with several different factors, you know, including freeboard and geotechnical integrity and whether an interior drainage analysis has been done. They need to have all these requirements before they can be accredited. And if they're not, then FEMA basically removes the levee from the study, from the floodplains analysis. So what happens is the floodplain that gets mapped is based on a natural valley floodplain model, which the natural valley floodplain model basically assumes that certain levees are removed that are not accredited. And so there might be locations where flow can get out of the Rio Grande floodway because a certain segment is not accredited. And so therefore it uses this natural valley floodplain to map the official floodplain, which will require flood insurance from the population that's within that. So we know that in El Paso, that's a very controversial subject because there are some large areas of population that will be mapped as if it's not, there's not a levee in place. And so this flood plan actually does have some requirements in the scope of work. One of those requirements is that there is you must consider, so this is under task 2A of the scope of work from Texas Water Development Board, the existing conditions flood risk analysis. And I just wanted to highlight here that we must consider, it says, in developing a high-level region-wide GIS-based existing condition flood exposure analysis using the information identified in the flood hazard analysis to identify who and what might be harmed within the region for, at a minimum, both the 1% and 0.2% annual chance flood events as follows. One of those requirements is that we must consider the population and property located in areas where existing levees or dams do not meet FEMA accreditation as inundated by flooding without those structures in place. Provisionally accredited structures may be allowed to provide flood protection unless best available information demonstrates otherwise. So in other words, where we have a deliverable that comes out of this state flood plan, one of those deliverables is a flood map of what we consider to be the most accurate depiction of risk for the 1%, which is the 100-year event, and the 0.2% annual chance, which is the 500-year event. And on those floodplain maps, we're going to have to, wherever we don't have an accredited levee, at least for the 100-year, we're going to have to show that as a levee being removed. So I know that that is a sensitive topic, but it is actually required in our scope of work, and it's part of the rules that everyone across the state is is required to use when they are assessing flood risk, so that everything is measured on an equal playing field when you're considering funding for certain projects and what population is at risk. And just to wrap up this slide, there is one segment of levee in El Paso that is accredited, and it's in the Central and East Texas. It's called Central and East El Paso, the city of El Paso, and it is called the EP2A, I believe. It stretches from International Dam to I think the Zaragoza Bridge or around that area. But the rest of the levees throughout the region, along the Rio Grande anyways, are not accredited. So I'll pause right there in case there are any questions from anybody about that so far.
This is Jeff. Will you be showing us a map where this accredited versus non-accredited levies are?
Yeah, we can. We didn't have that on the presentation. I'm just wondering if we have it.
At a later date's fine. I don't want to rush you.
Yeah, certainly have it somewhere. I just don't think I'll be able to find it anywhere handy at this moment. But yeah, if I could get some time at the end, I'll try and find somewhere where we can pull that up. But yeah, oh, you know what? I have a website open. So I believe it was the National Levy Database, because the Fathom, which I talked about a little bit earlier, we'll get into this here in a second. But yeah, I do think we can kind of show where that area is located. I'll try and pull that up while I'm talking. But yeah, I think that if I can show that National Levy Database, here it is. Let me just pull it over. So one of the assumptions in the Fathom data set is that it only considers levies if they are in the National Levy Database, and I believe the requirement is if they're accredited in the National Levy Database or shown as accredited by FEMA. That's something that I'm in the process of clarifying with our subconsultant Aqua Strategy, since they helped work on that Fathom model. But he was saying that Barney Austin was saying that, yeah, it is based on the National Levy Database and the level of protection that is in there for that levy. But I don't see any specific storm events for levies, levels of protection in the database. I just see if it's an accredited levy system or not. So when we're looking at the Rio Grande, there is this section. Let's see if I can find the segments here. I believe it's going to be this.
Chris, I'll try to find a map and show it by the end of the meeting.
Okay. Yeah. Sorry. We'll keep going. But yeah, it basically goes through Central and East El Paso.
Sorry, Chris, this is Delbert. I don't know if I can interrupt, but I don't know if
sure.
P.E. Macias or Dr. Bora have something to add, if that's consistent with what we know of our levies and their accreditation status, or if they have a map possibly they could share.
Yes, I can show that El Paso to levy from International Dam to Zaragoza Bridge. Yeah. Let me find out, and I can email to Chris.
Thank you, Dr. Bora. Sorry to put you on the spot.
I didn't mean to derail your talk there, Chris. Sorry.
Yeah, no worries. I thought it was color coded here in the screen capture, but it's just not cooperating like it looked earlier. I thought I could show it pretty quickly, but anyways, yeah. So that is kind of an issue. We'll talk a little bit more about is how Fathom considers those levies, and I think it's in a later slide. But if there are no other comments on the accreditation, then we'll move into the next slide. So there is a joint committee on Rio Grande project flood risk that has been established and developed a report with this title. And it was in 2019 when that was written. One of the main authors on that was Dr. Blair, who's with us today. And we were working with Dr. Blair on some of the 1D HEC-RAS modeling associated with that report. It is considered the best available model in our opinion. We talked a little bit with Dr. Bora before this call, and it seemed from his understanding that it also seemed like I guess the best publicly available model at this time. We know that there is, I'll skip to the bottom here, but there is a Freeze and Nichols study that's going on where they are looking at the H&H and the canalization reach of the Rio Grande, and that is at the 30% stage. So it's not expected to be available to the public until August of 2022. We know that we've requested from USIBWC any of their studies or reports that might touch on the 1% flows in the Rio Grande, and he provided this source right here, which is the flood frequency study for the Rio Grande between El Paso and Matamoros, and it or in Brownsville / Matamoros, and that's from 2003. There is also discussion of the flows in the Flow 2D model development below Caballo Dam, which is the model. This USACE 2005 model was the Flow 2D model that the Natural Valley pre-LAMP report uses as a sort of base, and then they sort of refined it in the FEMA study. So this Natural Valley pre-LAMP report, it describes the hydrology for what was considered in the preliminary FEMA models that are out right now, what was considered in the Rio Grande as far as that Flow 2D model and the hydrology assumptions that went into it, which, like I said, were mostly based on this 2005 Flow 2D model with some refinements to it. And now we're just going to jump into a little bit of summary about the joint committee study that Dr. Blair worked on. So Dr. Blair, if I get any of this correct, feel free to jump in and correct me. But this is the overall study area. It starts with Anthony, New Mexico, just outside of the El Paso County limits, and extends downstream to American Dam, which is within the city limits of El Paso. And some of the points I wanted to make a note of in this presentation, why we consider it the best available model, is it does use 2005 USACE hydrology. It also considers several other sources and compares, the different flow events at certain points from those different sources. But the HEC-RAS model that we worked on, the results that are in that appendix are based on the 2005 USACE hydrology. It also uses 2018 LIDAR, which was flown over the Rio Grande floodway at a time when the irrigation was not happening. So the river was dry, so it picked up the channel beds. It also picked up, we also have 2018 high resolution aerial imagery that was used with some of the LiDAR features to inventory the vegetation type and the extent. There are some sandbars and islands, you can call them, within the Rio Grande that had some extensive vegetation at the time when it was flown, and so we considered that when we were setting up these models. We set up cross sections every 100 feet, and we used obstructions as well as roughness values, which were extracted from a recent arid watershed research study to define, what is the effect of sedimentation in the Rio Grande, and what is, as well as vegetation for the irrigation purposes, but also from a flood risk perspective. But it was clear in the report that the hydrology was not certain, and so that's why part of the reason there were a range of flows considered. But we were able to define risk based on some of the assumptions from the 2005 USACE report. Assuming those flows, we ran the HEC-RAS model, and we were able to identify certain areas where either railroad embankments or levees were overtopped. And I say railroad embankments because they're the highest confining terrain in certain locations where it's not a certifiable levee. It wasn't designed to be a levee, but it's acting as a levee in certain locations. And we did notice that it was overtopped, depending on the flows that you assumed, at some of those locations where the railroad was acting as a levee, and also in some locations where there were actual levees. So that study does not actually delineate flood extent. It has an approximate area where flooding would be expected, but since we did a 1D model, we weren't comfortable saying, oh, this is an exact area that would be inundated, because you would really need more like a 2D model or something like the Natural Valley floodplain analysis to define flood risk. So it doesn't have a clear extent of flooding. It's just an approximate area that it shows in certain figures. Back to the fathom discussion for a little bit. As I mentioned, in certain locations where we're going to need to be mapping flood risk, we'll need to consider using the best available models. In a lot of our region, that's going to be the Fathom 2D model, which has some high level assumptions in it. And one of those assumptions when it comes to levees is that unless it is in the National Levee Database, and I believe the criterion would be it has to be called out as a FEMA accredited levee in the National Levee Database, then it will basically be modeled as if the levee's not there. And so that would basically be the case through most of our region, with the exception of that EP2 levee we discussed earlier. And like Dr. Bohr said, we'll try to get a map out to everyone. It may not be during this presentation, but afterwards you can see exactly the extent of that EP2 levee. We do have different models in the El Paso County area that can be used instead of that Fathom data, because there was a recent preliminary FEMA study. There was the Natural Valley study. There was also an interior drainage study that I worked on with the county, EP County and EP Water, that was from 2021 that considers the levees there. And that would be used eventually in the accreditation. In the event that some of these segments become accredited, then those models would be used for officially changing the FEMA floodplains wherever the levees become accredited. So we're not planning on using the Fathom data in El Paso County, but it is an option to be used outside of the county in areas where we have very limited modeling. So some considerations with the Rio Grande hydrology. Yeah.
Sorry, Sal, I believe Sal has a question.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, just a real quick question. I understood, that if the levies are not accredited, they will not be considered in the model. But when the model is being done, does it consider both sides of the levies non-existent at the same time, or does it get modeled that one side is still up and the other side is gone, and then it flows into the west side, let's just say, takes the maximum amount of flow? Or does it assume both sides are gone? Like, how is the model done?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the natural valley floodplain analysis, it assumes several different scenarios. It defines them as hydraulic scenarios, 1, 2, 3, all the way, I think, up to 20 or 21 different scenarios, where they will remove certain segments in this flow 2D model, and they will allow flow out of those segments. And so it has many different scenarios. But I guess what you're asking is, what does it assume on the Mexico side? Is that right?
Well, no. I'm assuming, let's say, for example, if we look at the highly populated area, say, of the El Paso County and city, where between Canutillo and the American Dam, where we have both sides of the levees, certain portions are accredited, certain portions are not on both sides. So when the model is being done to get the correct numbers, if the reason we're not considering the levies is because they are simply not accredited, okay, are we modeling assuming both sides are gone, or are we using the scenario by saying if one is breached and the water's gone all to one side and the other side is still holding? Because it will change the BFE on, say, if we assume the west side levee is gone and the east side is still there, the BFE, the requirements on the west side will be much higher than if you assume both are not there, non-existent, because they're not accredited. Then the BFE would be much lower elevation.
Right. So I'll just start out saying that these maps that we're producing here are not regulatory maps. So whatever assumptions we make in these will be based on the state flood plan scope of work and whatever other assumptions within those requirements that we discuss and talk about, in this subcommittee and in the regional flood planning groups. So I just want to make a point that the maps that we come out with at the end of this study, there's no obligation for FEMA to then eventually one day adopt our maps. They're separate from regulatory maps. They're separate from maps that are going to require floodplain insurance or that type of thing. So with that being said, one of the requirements, as I mentioned in the scope of work, is to only consider accredited levees as flood protection. So in this example that you gave, if there was one side of the river that had an accredited levee and the other was not accredited, then yes, we would consider that one that's on one side of the levee to be there, and the other one would allow flow out on that side.
So let me break in for just a second, Chris. So that's a very astute question, because and it's one that needs to be. There's a lot of uncertainties associated with how we take out these levees that determine, like you said, the BFEs on either side, right? And there's no one single right answer for how much of El Paso would be flooded if the levees weren't there. In terms of the way these projects are being evaluated, if all the water went out into one side of the city rather than the other side of the city, you would have significantly different amounts of damage than if it went out on both sides at the same time. So I think what we need to do is propose is talk to TWDB and resolve how they want to deal with that situation. Because clearly, if the levee fails on one side of the river, it's going to basically protect the other side of the river. It's unlikely that both of them are going to fail. So I think there are questions we have to go over with and scenarios we have to go over with TWDB to get some clarity on that issue. Their current guidance, as Chris said, is very simple. If the levee, and it's written in stone, is that if the levee is not certified, you don't model it like it's there. But that doesn't necessarily give an accurate idea of what the actual risk is. But that's the risk that they're defining as their existing condition. But we need to have discussions with them on that topic. Is that?
I agree. Yeah, in a way, I mean, we know that the answer is clear. If one is accredited and the other side is not, yeah, of course we have to model it that way. But if both are not accredited, both sides, I was still just taking both out and modeling it with that both. Then the BFE will be slightly different than further south. I mean, is that the way? Yes, it's really no one answer, and it is kind of a broad way to look at it.
And it gets complicated. It gets complicated because if you have a levee out upstream, right, then you have less flow in the river downstream.
Right.
So
you see, that's why I just think it's
a complicated deal that needs to be discussed, because it's really the guidance that TWB is given is pretty absolute, and we just need to go to them and get some clarity on that, because that becomes our baseline against which all our benefits for whatever projects we're doing get counted.
I agree. Thank you for the explanation.
It's a very good question.
All right. So, was there any other questions? Yeah.
I'm not sure how those rules will work when you're in the international portion of the Rio Grande, since FEMA isn't accrediting levees on the other side of the border.
Yep, we need clarity on
bring up TWDB.
Yeah, we need clarity on that also.
Right.
My suspicion is they're just going to say, assume the Mexican levee's whole. But if the Mexican levees are low or non-existent, that's something that clearly we might want to think about. But those are all questions for TWDB. And we will, as part of this committee, make up a whole set of scenarios that we need to run by and get clarity on how to deal with them. And it's very helpful that IBWC is participating in this to provide their insights.
All right. So I guess moving on here, some of the assumptions I wanted to talk about the hydrology, that why there is some uncertainty there, and some of the several factors that affect the hydrology. One of them is the consideration of flows backing up into agricultural drains that drain into the Rio Grande. Some of these initial studies from 1996, which was the initial study that the 2005 USACE study was based upon, it had assumed flows backing up into some of those agricultural drains, which actually was a significant portion of flow. I think it was about 8,000 CFS out of 20,000 CFS along those lines that were assumed to be taken out of the Rio Grande and backing up into the agricultural drains. However, since 1996, a lot of those drains have had gates installed at these wasteways, which would prevent flow from backing up into them during a flood event. And so, that's a significant factor that is not considered in the 2005 study or in the FEMA study, which is based on the 2005 study. So that could be, we could be significantly underestimating flows in the Rio Grande through this reach that was studied in the Joint Committee study, and that was one of the issues that was brought to light in that study. There's a choice of what discharge to assume from Caballo Dam, depending on whether it's during routine seasonal flows or peak flood flows. So the level of the water in Caballo Dam will affect how much flow they're releasing. Now, there is some operational protocol between those operators of Caballo Dam, and if there is flood risk downstream in El Paso, for example, if they're expecting a flood, then they can curtail those flood releases out of the dam and maybe stop them altogether if they're expecting a major flood in the El Paso region. But the thing to point out is that that wouldn't have an effect on the flows in the Rio Grande until 3 days later. So you really need an advance warning of that storm in El Paso. And so just the understanding that protocol and what happens when the dam is full versus empty and during irrigation season is important to understand. And so that's a factor as well. And typically the rainy season in El Paso is during the irrigation season. But there's also the bulking factor for sediment in the Rio Grande. The level of sediment in the Rio Grande is dependent on maintenance that's performed and how often, and it changes year by year. And so that, whether to assume a bulking factor will also affect the levels in the Rio Grande and in the flows that we assume. Statistical rainfall. Texas just came out with Atlas 14 rainfall within the last couple of years. New Mexico has Atlas 14 or NOAA Atlas rainfall that wasn't part of that 1996 study. I believe the FEMA pre-LAMP study actually implemented an adjustment factor for the NOAA rainfall when they took those flows from the 2005 study. So they did account for NOAA rainfall in New Mexico, I believe, but not Texas, because that wasn't out yet. There's also the extent of the hydrologic model calibration and the estimation of outflows through the levee breaches, which can all affect the flows that you're considering. So that's just some of the bullet points. For hydraulics, we've got the sedimentation in the Rio Grande is also, as I mentioned, a factor there for the hydraulics and how much can be conveyed. I think I already mentioned all these bullets that USIBWC, they maintain that sediment, and also growth of vegetation is a factor, and there can be some really high grass which could actually fully block flow if you've seen some of those locations where it got really high at some point, and that can vary by year as well. So those all affect the capacity of the Rio Grande and what flood level can be contained by the levees in the Rio Grande. Consideration, so the extent of flooding adjacent to the Rio Grande, as we mentioned, depends on the Rio Grande stage. So it's going to depend on the hydrology, it's going to depend on the hydraulics.
So, Chris, talk about this being an interior drainage study and explain what that is.
So an interior drainage study is what's needed if you're going to accredit a levee. With FEMA, you need to have an interior drainage study. That's something we just completed with El Paso County. It basically considers the flooding on the landward side of the levee if there was a local storm event. And so that is something that is available for El Paso County, but it's not available for the rest of the county, or I'm sorry, the rest of the region. So was there something in particular you wanted to mention about that, Jeff?
Well, they have to understand that the amount of water that accumulates on the levee side, on the interior side of the levee, between the levee and the mountains, depends upon how high the river stage is, because the amount that you can discharge into the river is based upon how high the river itself is and how much you're able to pump, right? So you need your amount of flooding is a function of how big the Rio Grande, how high the Rio Grande is at the time that you have this storm on the interior side.
Right. You can make different assumptions on the tailwater of the outfalls that flow into the Rio Grande on these different interior drainage studies. So for example, the one we did for El Paso, we did a coincidence analysis to estimate what's the likelihood of a 100-year storm in the Rio Grande occurring at the same time as a 100-year storm on the landward side. And for that study, we estimated that it was not as likely. So we had low flows in the Rio Grande. We didn't have 100-year flows in the Rio Grande, but even those low flows will change depending on the sediment and the vegetation. And if you increase the stage in the Rio Grande, if you have a gravity outfall that drains into the Rio Grande, for example, you're not going to be able to get as much drainage into the river, and that's going to affect your flooding on the landward side. So those are all factors considered in an interior drainage study. Next, we'll talk a little bit about.
Sal has a question. Sorry.
Oh, go ahead, Sal.
I'm sorry, I don't want to prolong this much longer, but I go back to the same question. If we're assuming the levees do not exist in any of the models, how does that affect the interior drainage, since the water is not going to be queuing to get in the river? We're assuming the levees do not exist. So how does that work? There'll be no tailwater assumptions or nothing.
Well, we have an accredited levee in El Paso, so it applies to that.
Yeah, but what about the portions, say, it's also El Paso County that's beyond north of borderland? Those levees are not accredited. Some of it is even just railroad embankment.
All right.
What are we doing there?
Okay, so what happens there is we're going to come up with, as part of this project, we're going to come up with solutions, right? So the solution where there's no accredited levee is you're going to put in an accredited levee. But when you put in an accredited levee, you don't solve all the problems on the interior side. You only solve the problem that's not going to be inundated by the interior drainage, right? So you have to, if the interior drainage is still too high, you have to have a solution that addresses both of them, the flooding from the river and the flooding on the interior side. So you may have to have a combination strategy that fixes the levee and adds pumping capacity on the interior side. So you have to know what the flooding is on the interior side also when you fix the levee. It comes into the second phase.
Yeah, I don't envy you with that kind of assumptions that had to be made, assumption whether it exists or it does not exist. And I just think at some point that particular requirement by FEMA, it does unjustly put a lot of properties, in a floodplain that historically has not been. So that's just my point. And it would have been a whole lot easier if we could have somehow figured out how to model it with those levees being as an existing structure that does offer a certain level of protection somehow, and see what that comes up with.
Go ahead, Jeff.
No.
Well, I was just going to point out that.
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead, Chris.
Well, when we are considering projects and strategies, such as an example of a project would be getting a levy into the accreditation stage, basically. And so for those models, we would be considering the levies in place. But in order to get funding for a project like that, we've got to demonstrate the risk. And so as part of our study, which again is totally separate from the regulatory FEMA study and what requires insurance, we don't affect that. We're not going to be able to affect FEMA's rules about whether they consider levies accredited or not. Just because if we had chosen to model them as in place, that wouldn't have really changed what requires who to pay flood insurance. But what it would affect is the amount of people in this plan, the population at risk. And if you don't consider those levies there, you're going to have a much bigger population at risk, and you're going to get a lot more attention in the state flood plan to say, hey, we really need to do something in this area. Look at all this population that's at risk. What can be done and how much funding is needed, that type of attention. So they're just kind of different animals, but yeah, we understand it's a controversial subject, but we've got to consider the scope of work, because what's in that scope of work is what everyone else in the state is using to assess their risk on the same playing field, if that makes sense. All right. If there's nothing else on that, then I'll just move on to the, let's see. I think we talked about that slide. Yeah, we didn't talk about this one. So because there are so many considerations with defining flood risk adjacent to the Rio Grande main stem, we're proposing a flood mitigation strategy where we would use the Joint Committee's study as the best available model, that HECRAS model. And we'd have to make the appropriate modifications to it for the projects where we're considering maybe getting certain levies accredited. But right now that considers the levies in place. And so we'll need to some sort of model that considers the levies there to demonstrate the benefits, right, of having a project that accredits a certain section of levee segment. So for our proposed conditions modeling, we're considering using a flood management strategy that uses that Joint Committee studies hydraulic model. And that would also assume the 2005 USACE flows, which may not be the most conservative. And we also know that there is a change in hydrology coming that we won't have available till August of 2022. So we would have to consider that as well, that the hydrology could change. But that is an option, is considering that, since it has 2018 LIDAR in there, and it considers some of the sedimentation, the most recent sedimentation and vegetation than any other model that we're aware of at this time. We think that would be our best tool in order to model some of the alternatives and to see what kind of benefits we would get if certain levies were to be accredited, or any other projects associated with the Rio Grande. Also, we will develop and prioritize risk areas that are associated with accredited levee overtopping. So that is a little bit complicated, because, for example, in the one area of El Paso where we have an accredited levee, say this Friese-Nickel study and Wilson study comes out in August 2022, and it has different flows through the Rio Grande because they updated the hydrology, and now maybe that accredited levee section overtops for the 100-year. Then what do we do in that scenario if we're considering a project for that levee, for example? Do we assume that levee will wash away for existing conditions? that's something that we just need to really define what are our assumptions going to be for overtopping if the flows change in the levee that's already accredited, because we don't think that we'd necessarily have to remove that levee section if it's already accredited, but how do you consider that? We want to be consistent with what the other regions in the state are assuming for those types of scenarios. So we'll have to develop a method specifically for that, and then whatever methods we define are going to help us prioritize our flood management projects. So that's kind of the end goal, is defining what plan we use in order to come up with a priority of flood management projects. So this last slide is a draft of a recommendation we could make to the regional flood planning group. We know that there's a need for revised hydrology and hydraulics in the Rio Grande.
Can we discuss these one by one, Chris, and kind of get the input from the committee on whether we think that's a good idea or not?
Sure. Yeah, so this first bullet is, we talked about some of the uncertainties with the existing studies on the hydrology in the Rio Grande and on the hydraulics. And so we were planning, or it's up for debate whether we propose as one of our FMEs revised hydrologic and hydraulic study of the Rio Grande. Now, again, we know that there is a study underway by Friesen Nichols and Wilson, a joint venture for the USIBWC that will be available in August of 2022. So maybe we don't consider the FME, or we just consider sort of a limited study in that reach, which we know will be updated eventually, but downstream of American Dam, where we're not expecting any additional studies, then we might need to do a separate FME for just that.
Yes.
But that level of detail, I don't think we need to get into for a recommendation. Basically, what we're proposing is just to create an FME in general for revised hydrology, and maybe it's a separate one for revised hydraulics. But we'll try to keep it as general as possible for our recommendation. But we think there is a need for that, and we don't think we have really detailed H&H models in order to get the type of benefit quantification that we would really need for our projects. So this would be a proposed FME. Are there any thoughts on that? Any objections?
I agree with you. This is Gisela with El Paso Water. I think we need to have a compiled, or I guess a new study that shows what the actual numbers are in the Rio Grande, instead of having all of these unknowns, because then we're gonna have too much, I guess, too many unknowns in order to be able to provide adequate recommendations to the group.
Yeah, that was our conclusion as well from reviewing and working with Dr. Blair on that.
Well, does anybody else have any input on this topic?
Well, it would be the same input as I had before, and I don't want to frustrate everybody. I know this written very clearly, the unaccredited levies will not be included in definition of the existing risk, I just, think that at least, we'd know what it would look like if these levies that offer a certain level of protection, assuming that, let's say, beyond the levies, areas that we're not looking at the levies for, existing structures such as a hill or a side of a whatever that is considered as an obstruction of water, whether it's coming from interior or from any body of water.
So,
You know what I'm saying?
yeah,
we're considering natural obstructions in the modeling, but yet we're not considering levees that have been constructed to a high level of engineering, as offering any level of protection, zero.
right. So you could make the flood planning group could say, I think there's no flexibility at all on this. There's certain specified risk maps that have to be created by TWDB to make it the same across the state. If you would like to, in addition, see a risk map that includes the existing levees, then that can be done as part of the study that you may need for whatever reason to identify the priority of projects. That can be done. You just have to make a recommendation that be done and have it approved by the committee. You understand what I'm saying? It's not going to be part of this well-defined deliverable that TWDB wants, which is the risk map without the levees. But you can say, as part of our decision-making process to decide between which projects are the highest priority, let's figure out what's actually at risk now, and then use that information in your qualitative decisions on how to choose projects. But that's got to be voted on by the committee and the subcommittee and the committee.
Right.
Okay.
And I think that's sort of covered in this bullet, which is what we're proposing in the interim. While we don't have these detailed H&H models, we've kind of put together an FMS, flood management strategy, where we can take some of the best available models and make some assumptions or some rules that we're going to follow when assessing risk and trying to develop projects and prioritize those projects. Just since I skipped over this, I noticed there's a little typo here, but I mentioned earlier that we'll seek guidance from the TWDB on assumptions related to overtopping accredited
Don't go
levies.
through them. There's too many of them. We've already talked about. There's many issues there, as Sal pointed out.
So do we want to remove this bullet then from?
No. Just don't spend time listing them right now, because I think we have to come up with that. I think we've already discussed them previously.
Okay.
I agree.
Okay, so do we still want to go through these though, right, Jeff?
Yes.
Or FMSs?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So in the interim, when we don't have these detailed H&H models that we think are needed to really define our projects, we still want to put together a strategy or some sort of package that says, okay, we know this is an issue and something needs to be done here, but without the detailed models, what approach do we use to assess risk in these areas, and how can we develop initial projects and prioritize those projects where we don't have these detailed models? So that's where this FMS would come in. And so while these flood management evaluations are taking place, we would do a flood management strategy that upstream of American Dam, we could use the Joint Committee hydraulic HECRAS model, and we could do a sensitivity study where we basically run a series of flows, maybe as similar to what was talked about in the Joint Committee study, where there were several different sources of flows. We could run a range of flows for the 100-year based on different sources or different assumptions. We could run a range of sediment scenarios based on a certain level of maintenance by the IBWC, which we would of course coordinate with them on what those assumptions would be for sort of minimum capacity in the Rio Grande. And And one thing that I wanted to point out from Sal's last comment, is that there might be some projects in the interior that you wouldn't really notice because it's not accredited in, which is adjacent to the Rio Grande, and the Natural Valley floodplain is used as the floodplain. So you might not see certain flooding issues that are there, but they're kind of covered up by that Natural Valley floodplain. So if there are certain locations which are maybe pointed out by community members, or certain studies like the interior drainage study, which was just done in 2021, those assume that the levees are there. So studies like that can be used to identify some of the projects maybe adjacent to the levees that aren't really related to the levees, but which are still problem flooding areas. We can use those models in those certain locations. I think I'll just move on to this point right here, is that we do need to coordinate. Once again, I mentioned this with TWDB on what to assume for flows that do get out of accredited levees. Like, for example, if the hydrology changes in the Rio Grande and the one levee we do have that is accredited is no longer containing the 100-year, do we model that levee as washing away completely, or do we just model the amount of flow that gets out from overtopping? We're going to try to coordinate with TWDB on that.
That's basically the same bullet we had above.
Yeah, so maybe I'll just remove this bullet. Does that make more sense? Because we already have it right here.
Because that one applies everywhere, not just where that. No, that's good. That's fine. That's good. Either one. Take either one out. Right.
Okay. And then and then downstream of American Dam, which is really the majority of our study area is downstream of American Dam. We've just been spending a lot of time talking about this reach upstream because there is such a high population at risk, that is really affected by some of the assumptions of these models. But downstream of American Dam, we would still need to come up with the best available model to use to assess risk and prioritize projects. And so we'll need to coordinate with the US IBWC on what to select in each region. And based on some of the coordination we had with Dr. Bora, before this call, it sounded like there is a 1D HEC-RAS model that is pretty outdated, I believe, Dr. Bora, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it is in HEC-RAS, and so it might be something that can be used south of the El Paso County limits. But we do know that in El Paso County, they have the FEMA Flow 2D model. So that would be the best. Yeah, that would be the best available model that I know of within El Paso County. So is there anything on that subject, Dr. Bohr, that you wanted to help clarify on what maybe we can use, I guess, South American Dam within El Paso County? Do we think that FEMA Flow 2D model is probably the best available there, but then downstream of the county, it's that other HEC-RAS 1D model? Is that your understanding?
Yes, we have a very old HEC-RAS model now. It was developed in 2005. And then FEMA's Natural Valley analysis, I think they have that Flow 2D model all the way to Fort Quitman.
Right.
From American Dam to Fort Quitman.
Yeah, that was my understanding as well. So that's kind of the direction we're leaning, is that those will be. We'll have to look at the level of detail in that 1D HEC-RAS model. So yeah, if you could go ahead and start the process of sending that to us, Dr. Bora, we can start there by just seeing the level of detail there and what updates we might be able to make to that to get it up to the level that we need to assess some of these projects. But yeah, if you could please go ahead and send us that model, that'd be a good starting point.
Chris,
Okay,
do we have
yeah,
any information? Sorry.
It's okay. Go ahead. Yeah.
Just a quick question. Maybe it is for Dr. Bora and for Chris. Do we have any information on the status of the levees on the Mexican side?
No, we don't have any information. We can ask for them, no, but it's very difficult to get it because they don't have any standard like what we have here on, like we have a FMEs that 3 feet of levee freeboard on top of our base flood level, but they don't have that kind of standard, so their levee may not be as high as ours.
So how does that incorporate in our modeling, affecting us, basically?
I think
we assume that their levees do not exist?
Yeah, I think that. Go ahead.
Yeah, based on survey, and also LIDAR data, we can get those kind of information on Mexican side. But their levee, they don't have standard like what we have, that we need at least 3 feet of freeboard.
Right, and I think that's
in fact, just a minute. In fact, here in El Paso to that levee segment, they are not showing actually any flood elevation in that area because of sensitivity to Mexico. Even on the river side, they will not show any base flood elevation because they don't agree with Mexico will have to agree if they do those modeling together. We have to do both sections. It should be a binational model. But all the modeling we did from US IBWC, from US section, and so they don't actually recognize those. And they say also they don't need the levee like 3 feet above freeboard. So although the international boundary at the center of the Rio Grande, but FEMA will not show any flood elevation on, they will show only on the land side of the levee, not on the river side.
I see. That's another big challenge for you guys.
Yeah, so I added a little bit to this bullet based on that discussion is, we want to know, we'll seek out clarity from TWDB on what to assume for not only when a accredited levee gets overtopped, but what assumptions to make for the levees on the Mexican side when we're evaluating risk, because yeah, that does affect things.
Yeah, especially if they don't recognize the 3 foot freeboard, it will always stop on their side, not on our side. So our risk is pretty much minimized.
Right. And I don't know if this should say, and Jeff, chime in here if you disagree, but I don't know if it should say AECOM needs to propose to the RFPG a short-term procedure, or if we should say the RFPG should seek clarity from TWDB on a short-term procedure for estimating risk with out-of-levee flows and assumptions to make for levees on the Mexican side. Jeff, are you still there? Yeah. Oh, you're on mute if you're talking.
I was on mute. So should see clarity from, yes, that's right. First.
Juju.
Okay. All right. And then, yeah, as we mentioned here, we use interior drainage study to define risk adjacent to the Rio Grande. But I don't know if it's clear here. Jeff, do you think we need to reword this one, or anyone else, for short duration storms in El Paso County where levees are not overtopped, Is this worded how
I
we
think that's
want it?
worded okay. I think that's, you can just say where levees exist. Just say
The
not
levies exist, you're right. I think that's. And when we say short duration storms, are we talking, should we clarify that to say from interior drainage events?
Well, that's all in the study. So I don't think you have to define it better than that. We don't study 3-day storms in the interior drainage study. We study short duration storms. Sure, we study the 24-hour storm, which is different than what causes the flooding on the Rio Grande.
Yeah, I'm just wondering if that's clear for, general public. They're all going to understand that, or if we need to make that more clear, because we're not saying we'll use the interior drainage as in our flood risk, existing flood risk mapping. We're saying we'd use it for any project that is adjacent to the Rio Grande where there are flooding issues unrelated to the levees, right?
I don't think we need any more definition than that, Chris. I think you just, that's the model we're going to use for risk adjacent to the Rio Grande where levees exist.
Okay. And then lastly, we would propose to map interior drainage floodplain downstream of El Paso with fathom and fathom assumptions, which my understanding are consistent with what the state flood plan requires, because they're based on the National Levy Database and whether that National Levy Database says the FEMA levy is accredited or not. So I think that would be within the guidance of, or within the requirements of the state flood plan. So any questions on any of these? Does anyone disagree? Basically, we're planning to have this as a slide in the next flood planning group, regional flood planning group meeting, and put it up for a vote if they agree with this general approach. And maybe I'll just clarify here, create an FMS with the following assumptions. Any objections?
Will there be a short brief on the fathom assumptions in the slide show that you're going to, so we can get an idea of the, what fathom's assumptions were?
Yeah, I think that's needed. I think we have to know where they're in the areas, particularly around Presidio. What are they assuming for the levels, right?
Might give us some guidance where we are now here.
Right. Yeah, we'll reach out to Aqua Strategies, who's on our team, and we'll try to get some additional information about their assumptions before this next meeting. Brian, did you have a comment about the FMS, about adding this last?
Yeah, I was just wanted to get clarification. Are we doing this? Is this for task 4, or are these set of recommendations for the risk that we are defining in task 2?
Oh no, this would be for task 4, where we're trying to propose FMEs and FMSs. The risk that we're defining in task 2 will have to, we know that we're going to have to assume that the levy is not there. So yeah, this is specifically for task 4, where we're talking about FMEs and FMSs, which is the focus of this subcommittee. All right. Well, that's all I have. Sorry, I forgot there's two more portions to this meeting. Unless there's any other questions, we'll go ahead and include.
Do we need to? Does the subcommittee need to vote on the recommendation before it's presented as a recommendation?
Yeah, let's go ahead and do that. That would be a good idea, Brian.
Okay.
Oh, Sal just walked out. How about we get Sal to come back in? Thanks, Sal. Sorry about that. Go ahead, Jeff.
Chris, can you correct where it says create and FMS and create it an, no D?
Oh yeah, thank you. Thanks.
And before we do this vote, Chris, are you sure this is an FMS and it's not it's not just an FME?
Well, yeah, the FME is there's going to be a need for detailed H&H studies. The FMS is what do we assume in the meantime when we're trying to prioritize flood projects in.
All right. Okay. All right. I'm on to the next.
Okay, so then if I we lost some of our subcommittee members, so Sal or Levi, if either one of you would want to make the motion. Oh, you're on mute, Sal.
I'll make a motion to move forward with the slideshow as presented by AECOM to the next meeting at Regional Floodplain Group.
I'll second that.
Okay, thank you. All right. Do we have any discussion, objections? Okay, so all those in favor say aye.
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 Okay, so motion will pass. And then, so what we'll talk about then real quick is the chairs. If this is what you get for sticking it out to the end of the meeting, Sal or Levi. Omar did walk out, so we can put it on him, but do we want to, are either of you interested in serving as the chair for this subcommittee? And again, if the kicker is that you would need to be, if either of your establishments will allow for public participation, then we can have it based in your at your office, or if not, we can have it here at the Council of Governments. But we just need that name on the memo, I mean on the agenda, and then anyone else who participates can still do that virtually.
And Levi, you're located in Midland?
Yeah, Odessa? Yeah.
Odessa. I mean, I don't mind serving in that as the chair. It's just that, you know, being a private business owner, as you know, many of you would know, my time is so taxed with so many different things. If it doesn't take more than what just the meetings, the involvement and review of the documents, you know, I wouldn't mind doing it. But my establishment is very small. My company space, we don't even have a conference room. So we'll probably need to use yours.
If it's not a hindrance on you to come to our office on Airway, we can definitely accommodate you, Sal.
Okay.
Levi, is there any interest on your side?
Not at this time, no, ma'am.
Okay. All right. Well then, so then we're looking at Sal serving as the chair for subcommittee. Okay. And do you want to make the motion, Levi?
I'll make the motion.
I guess I'm the only second here. If the only
yes,
two
you're
left.
the only second. Yes.
Okay, second.
All right. So all those in favor, say aye.
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 Okay, motion passes. All right. So then the next item is going to be the next date for our the next subcommittee meeting, and subcommittee 1 is having their meeting on October the 21st at 10 a.m. It would be difficult for us to have an afternoon meeting that same day because, well, I guess we could have a meeting on that day. The only thing is that I won't be present because I need to do the water planning. But for AECOM and for Levi, if it's more conducive for you to have these two meetings in this one day, we can look at that as well. What are your, Levi, what do you think? Would you like it broken out, or would you like to just have it?
I'm
And then
indifferent,
as well.
and whatever easiest on the other subcommittee members. I'm pretty flexible on my schedule.
Okay. Isela,
And-
are you
and
on
that
the
next-
No, she's not. Go ahead. I'm sorry, Sal.
Sorry. So the next coming up date would be the same date as when we have another regional flood planning regional meeting, or
It would be, well, subcommittee 1 is meeting on October the 21st at 10 a.m. But AECOM team, is that something that would work for you all, or would you want to propose a different date?
October 21st at 10 a.m. works for me.
Well, that's the time of subcommittee 1's meeting.
Oh,
correct?
sorry, I missed that.
Yeah.
So it would be what time then? Any
after that.
11? Okay.
I mean, we could propose,
So, yeah.
if you all are thinking that, you know, we started this at 1, so I know it's the first meeting, but if we're going to give ourselves an hour and a half, I think it might be good to keep it spaced between 10 a.m. and 1 p.m. So if 1 p.m. is okay with you all.
Yeah, I think that works for me.
On what date, Annette?
That would be October the 21st.
I do have a public hearing at that same time at 1:30.
Okay, then we'll look at a different time. A different. Do we want to go with the next? Do we want to go the 22nd? That I believe is Friday. Whatever you all want.
October 22nd, 10 a.m.
Yeah, we can do the morning. Is that okay with you all, AECOM?
That works for me too.
Yeah, that would work.
Okay, so we're going to set that for October 22nd at 10 a.m. And I will be sure to include all of our members, including Seda, so she can be sure to participate. So I think that will be everything that we have, unless there's any other items to discuss. We don't have anything else on the agenda, unless we have any questions right now.
You'll send an invite for that date, right, Matt?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
And we're going to keep them. We're going to keep the meetings on Teams. So it'll be the same format. I'll get the Teams invite from AECOM, and then I'll forward that out to the group.
Perfect.
We want to maybe look at establishing some other future dates right now, and maybe set up one more meeting that tells them a sequence of a series of meetings that goes out, and everybody has them on their calendar.
That's fine with me.
So what are you suggesting? Once a month?
I think we're looking at 3 weeks in between.
Okay, so the 22nd is the next one. So we'd be looking at maybe the 12th, if we keep Fridays as our days to meet.
Hey, Tom, what do you think?
Yeah, it's up to y'all if you want to stick to Fridays, or I'm open Wednesday and Thursday of that week as well. The 11th would work if we don't want to keep it on Fridays, but it's up to you all. Any of those 3 days, 10th, 11th, or 12th, would work for me.
Okay, Chairman.
The 10th worked for me too, but not the 11th. At that 10 o'clock, I have another board meeting.
So do you want to do November the 10th at 10 a.m.?
That works for me as well.